Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. When probability contradicts intuition. There is a game show, a host, 3 doors. Behind one door a car, behind the other 2 goats. The contestant picks a door. The host, who knows what is behind each door, opens a different door, revealing a goat. Then offers the contestant a choice: stay with the original door or switch to the remaining unopened door. And almost everyone's intuition says, it does not matter. Says the probability is now 50-50. Says switching and staying are equivalent because there are 2 doors left and one has the car. But this intuition is completely wrong. Switching doubles the chance of winning, gives a 2/3 probability instead of 1/3. And this is the Monty Hall problem, named after the host of Let's Make a Deal. And it has become famous not just as a probability puzzle, but as a demonstration of how badly human intuition performs with probability, how confidently people cling to wrong answers, how even mathematicians and statisticians initially rejected the correct solution. And this raises deep questions about rationality, about whether humans are capable of probabilistic reasoning, about whether intuition can be trusted in any domain, about what it means to be rational if rationality requires calculations that almost no one can perform. The solution requires seeing that the initial choice had a 1/3 chance of being correct, which means there was a 2/3 chance the car was behind one of the other 2 doors. And when the host opens one of those doors revealing a goat, that 2/3 probability does not disappear. It transfers entirely to the remaining unopened door. So switching gives a 2/3 chance, while staying gives only the original 1/3 chance. And this can be proven mathematically, can be demonstrated through computer simulation, can be explained through careful reasoning about conditional probability. But none of this stops people from insisting the answer must be 50-50, from rejecting the correct solution as absurd, from trusting their intuition over the mathematics. And this is not stupidity, not ignorance, not carelessness. This is the way human minds naturally process probability, the way intuition works when confronted with conditional probabilities and updating in light of new evidence. And the fact that intuition gets it wrong reveals something troubling about human rationality, about the gap between how we think we reason and how we actually reason, about the possibility that many of our confident judgments about probability are as wrong as the intuition that switching does not matter. Bayesian epistemology takes probability as fundamental to rational belief, says that beliefs should be assigned degrees of confidence, that these degrees should obey the probability calculus, that they should update through Bayes' theorem when new evidence arrives. And this seems like the right way to think about belief, seems to capture how science works, how learning happens, how rational agents should respond to evidence. But the Monty Hall problem shows that humans are not natural Bayesians, do not intuitively update probabilities correctly, do not automatically apply Bayes' theorem, do not even recognize when a situation calls for probabilistic reasoning rather than simple counting. And if this is true, then Bayesian epistemology is not a description of how humans actually reason, but a normative standard that almost no one meets, an ideal that is psychologically unrealistic, a requirement for rationality that makes rationality impossible for creatures like us. Kahneman and Tversky spent decades documenting the ways human probability judgments deviate from normative standards. The base rate neglect, where people ignore prior probabilities. The conjunction fallacy, where people judge conjunctions more probable than their components. The availability heuristic, where people estimate probability based on how easily examples come to mind. And these are not occasional errors, but systematic biases. Not mistakes that education eliminates, but deep features of human cognition that persist, even in experts, even in people who understand probability theory, even in situations where people are explicitly trying to reason correctly. And this research suggests that human minds are not built for probability, that our intuitions evolved for different problems, for quick judgments in environments where exact probabilities were unknown and unknowable, where rough heuristics that usually worked were better than precise calculations that took too long, and these heuristics still dominate our thinking, still produce judgments that feel right even when they are mathematically wrong. And the question is whether we should try to override these intuitions, should try to become more Bayesian, should train ourselves to calculate rather than intuit, or whether we should accept that humans are not and cannot be perfectly rational in the Bayesian sense, should build theories of rationality that fit how we actually think, rather than demanding we think in ways that are psychologically impossible. The reference class problem makes this even more difficult, because applying probability requires knowing what reference class to use, what group of similar cases to draw on when estimating probability, and there is often no unique right answer. Many reference classes are possible. They give different probabilities, and there is no mechanical rule for choosing among them. Only judgment, only intuition, only the same kind of thinking that gets Monty Hall wrong. And this means that even if humans could perfectly apply Bayes' theorem, even if we could update probabilities flawlessly, we would still face the problem of choosing which probabilities to start with, which reference class to use, which background assumptions to make. And these choices are not themselves governed by probability theory, are not mechanical, are not subject to the kind of rational constraint that Bayesianism promises. And this suggests that probabilistic rationality cannot be purely computational, cannot be reduced to algorithms, cannot eliminate the need for judgment that might be right or wrong in ways that transcend calculation. Subjective Bayesianism tries to handle this by saying that prior probabilities are subjective, are personal degrees of confidence that can differ between rational agents. And as long as priors satisfy the probability axioms and updating follows Bayes' theorem, any priors are rationally permissible, and agents with different priors will converge on the same posteriors given enough shared evidence, or so the theorem says. But this convergence can take a very long time, can require more evidence than is ever available. And in the meantime, agents with different priors will reach different conclusions, will make different predictions, will act differently, and there is no rational way to adjudicate between them. No standard that says one set of priors is better than another. No requirement beyond internal consistency, and this seems too permissive, seems to make rationality trivial, seems to allow anything as rational as long as it obeys the probability calculus. And conspiracy theorists obey the probability calculus. They just have different priors. They assign high probability to things most people assign low probability to, and they update on evidence in their own way. And by subjective Bayesian standards, they might be perfectly rational, just starting from different priors. And this cannot be right. This is not what rationality means. There must be some constraint on priors, some requirement beyond consistency, some standard that distinguishes reasonable from unreasonable starting points. But what that standard is, how to specify it, how to justify it without circularity, these questions have no clear answer. Objective Bayesianism tries to solve this by saying there are objective priors, that some probability assignments are privileged by logic or symmetry or information theory, that the principle of indifference or maximum entropy or some other principle determines what priors rationality requires. But each of these principles faces problems. The principle of indifference leads to paradoxes when applied to continuous quantities or overlapping partitions. Maximum entropy requires choosing a measure, and different measures give different entropies, and none of these principles seems to capture what we pre-theoretically think rationality requires. None of them vindicates our intuitive judgments about which beliefs are reasonable. And this suggests that the project of grounding probability in pure logic or symmetry has failed, that probability is not a priori but depends on empirical facts, on the actual frequencies in the world, on the causal structure of reality. And this leads back to frequentism, to the view that probabilities are objective features of the world, are long-run frequencies or propensities or chances built into the physical processes. But frequentism faces its own problems. The reference class problem returns, the problem of single cases where frequency makes no sense, the problem that different sequences can have the same frequency but seem to have different probabilities, and the debate between subjective and objective interpretations of probability remains unresolved. Remains one of the deepest puzzles in philosophy of science and epistemology, remains a place where intuition gives conflicting verdicts, and mathematics does not uniquely determine the right answer. The Monty Hall problem can be generalized, can be seen as an instance of a broader phenomenon where updating on evidence is counterintuitive, where the correct probability depends on assumptions about the process that generated the evidence, about whether the host had to open a door with a goat or could have opened any door, about whether the host knows where the car is or is opening doors randomly, and changing these assumptions changes the correct answer, changes whether switching is advantageous, and this shows that probability is not just about counting possibilities, but about modelling processes, about understanding the causal structure that generates observations, about getting the model right before applying the mathematics. And humans are bad at this, bad at seeing which model applies, bad at noticing when assumptions have changed, bad at tracking the difference between probability given this model and probability given that model. And this is another way intuition fails, another place where what seems obvious is wrong, another demonstration that probabilistic reasoning is harder than it seems, harder than most people realize. The three prisoners problem is similar. Three prisoners, one will be pardoned, a guard knows who but will not tell. One prisoner asks the guard to name one of the other prisoners who will not be pardoned. The guard names one, and the prisoner reasons that his probability of pardon has increased from 1/3 to 1/2 because now there are only two prisoners in the running. But this reasoning is wrong. His probability is still 1/3. The other prisoner's probability is now 2/3. And this is the same structure as Monty Hall, the same failure of intuition, the same mistake of thinking that eliminating one possibility distributes its probability equally among the remainder, when really the distribution depends on how the elimination happened, on whether it was random or constrained by knowledge. And the fact that the same mistake appears in different guises, that people make the same error repeatedly, even after being corrected, suggests this is not a mistake about particular problems, but a mistake about how probability works. A fundamental misunderstanding of conditional probability, of updating, of what it means for probabilities to change in light of evidence. Simpson's paradox is another case where intuition fails, where a trend appears in several groups, but reverses when the groups are combined, where a treatment seems effective in every subgroup but harmful overall, where the correct probability judgment depends on which level of description you adopt, which grouping you consider relevant, and there is often no mathematical fact about which grouping is right, only substantive judgment about causal structure, about which variables are relevant, about what the right reference class is, and this is the reference class problem again. The problem that probability requires not just mathematics but modelling, not just calculation, but judgment, and judgment can be wrong in ways that calculation cannot, can depend on intuitions that mislead, can vary between people who have access to the same mathematical facts. And this means that probabilistic rationality is not purely formal, not reducible to following rules, not something that could be programmed into a computer without also giving the computer the ability to model the world, to understand causal structure, to make substantive judgments about relevance and independence and which factors matter. And these abilities seem to require something like understanding, something like intelligence, something that goes beyond computation in any narrow sense. The Sleeping Beauty problem pushes this even further. Sleeping Beauty is put to sleep on Sunday. A fair coin is flipped. If heads, she is woken on Monday, and the experiment ends. If tails, she is woken on Monday, put back to sleep with memory erasure, and woken again on Tuesday. And when she wakes, she knows all this, but not what day it is or how the coin landed. And she's asked what probability she should assign to heads. And one argument says 1/2 because it is a fair coin, and her evidence does not distinguish heads from tails. And another argument says 1/3 because there are 3 possible wakings: Monday heads, Monday tails, Tuesday tails, and she should be equally uncertain about which one she is experiencing. And both arguments seem compelling. Both seem to capture something right about probability, but they give different answers, and philosophers have divided into halfers and thirders, have written papers and books arguing for their position, and no consensus has emerged, no decisive argument has appeared. And this suggests that probability itself is ambiguous, that there is no fact of the matter about. What probability means in cases like this, that different probability concepts give different answers, and there is no neutral standpoint from which to say which concept is correct. And if this is true, then rationality does not uniquely determine belief, does not provide the kind of objective standard that Bayesianism promised, allows for rational disagreement, even given identical evidence and identical priors in some sense. And this is disturbing, suggests that rationality is weaker than we thought, less constraining, less objective, more dependent on choices about how to frame problems and which probability concept to apply. The fine-tuning argument in philosophy of religion uses probability reasoning that many find suspicious, claims that the probability of a life-permitting universe is extremely low on naturalism, but not as low on theism, and therefore the existence of a life-permitting universe is evidence for theism. And this argument has the structure of Bayesian inference, has priors and likelihoods, and posteriors, but the probabilities involved seem impossible to specify, seem to require knowing about the space of possible universes and the probability distribution over them, and whether such probabilities even make sense. And skeptics argue that the argument trades on intuitions about probability that are as unreliable as the intuition that switching does not matter in Monty Hall, that it smuggles in assumptions through choices about reference classes, that it treats unknown probabilities as if they were 50-50 when there is no justification for this, and defenders argue that this is the only way to reason about such questions. That probability is the language of uncertainty, and if we cannot use probability, we cannot reason about unlikely events at all. And both sides seem right in some sense. Both seem to be pointing to real problems, and the debate remains unresolved because there is no agreed standard for when probability reasoning applies, for what makes a probability assignment reasonable, for how to choose reference classes in novel situations. The anthropic principle raises similar issues. The observation that we exist as observers places constraints on what we can observe. We cannot observe universes that do not permit observers, and this truism has been turned into arguments about probability, about whether observer selection effects should change our credences, about whether the fact that we are here is evidence for multiverse theories or fine-tuning or something else, and different formulations of the anthropic principle give different answers. The self-sampling assumption says you should reason as if you are a random sample from all observers. The self-indication assumption says you should favour theories that predict more observers. And these give conflicting recommendations, give different probabilities for the same observations, and there is no consensus about which is correct, no compelling argument that one captures rationality and the other does not. And this is another instance of the general problem, that probability reasoning requires background assumptions, requires choices about how to set up the problem, and these choices are not dictated by probability theory itself, are not mechanical, are not subject to the kind of objective, rational constraint that would make probabilistic epistemology a complete theory of rational belief. The possibility remains that human intuition about probability, despite being systematically wrong in many cases, is right in some deeper sense, is adapted to a different kind of rationality than mathematical probability captures, is tuned to ecological rather than abstract problems, to frequencies encountered in real environments rather than to single-case probabilities in artificial puzzles. And Gigerenzer has argued exactly this, has argued that humans are better at frequency reasoning than probability reasoning, that framing Monty Hall in terms of frequencies rather than probabilities makes the right answer intuitive, that many of the biases Kahneman and Tversky documented disappear when problems are presented in ways that match our evolutionary history. And this suggests that the problem is not with human rationality, but with the mismatch between how probability theory frames problems and how human minds naturally frame them. And if this is right, then the solution is not to train people to be more Bayesian, but to recognize that formal probability is one tool among many, appropriate for some contexts but not others, and that intuitive reasoning has its own logic, its own standards, its own domain of applicability, and trying to replace it entirely with formal calculation would be a mistake, would lose something valuable, would sacrifice the kind of quick approximate reasoning that actually works in most real-world situations for the sake of precision that is rarely achievable and often not worth the computational cost. The arrow points the wrong way, points from effect to cause rather than from cause to effect. And this reversal is not metaphor, but is the actual structure of causation, is what the philosopher proved through arguments that were rigorous, that were compelling, that were impossible to refute without abandoning principles that seemed more fundamental than the assumption that time moves forward, and the forward is what everyone believes, is what experience suggests, is what makes narrative possible, what makes agency meaningful, what makes the future open and the past fixed. But the fixed and the open are illusions, are the result of perspective, are artifacts of the way consciousness processes information, and the processing is backward, is receiving effects first and inferring causes later, is experiencing the present as the result of the past when really the present is determining what the past was, is selecting from the quantum superposition of possible pasts the one past that leads to this present, and the leading is backward, is from now to then, is causation in reverse. And reverse is what the philosopher demonstrated, is what the equations required, is what made sense of phenomena that forward causation cannot explain, cannot accommodate, cannot integrate into a coherent framework. And the framework that emerges from a reverse causation is strange, is counterintuitive, is violating every assumption about how time works. But the violations are what the evidence demands, are what quantum mechanics suggests, are what retrocausality makes explicit. And explicit is what the philosopher made it, made the argument that the future affects the past, that outcomes determine antecedents, that the arrow of causation points backward through time, and the backward is not time travel, is not influence across temporal distance, is the structure of time itself, is the geometry of causation, is the way that events relate to each other, not through forward propagation, but through backward determination. And the determination is not free, is not open, is not subject to choice, because choice is an illusion that emerges from not seeing the backward flow, from experiencing effects as if they were not already determined by what comes after. And what comes after is what causes what comes before, is selecting the past from the infinite possibilities, is making history actual through the occurrence of the present, and the present is not the result of the past but is the cause of the past, is determining which past occurred, which history is real, which antecedents were actual, and the actual is relative, is dependent on the present, is not fixed independently of what happens now, and now is what selects then, is what makes the past what it was, is the causal force that propagates backward, that determines history, that creates the appearance of forward causation by making the past consistent with the present. And the consistency is not temporal but is logical, is the requirement that effects have causes, but the having is backward, is the effect producing the cause, is the present requiring a past that leads to it, and the leading is not temporal propagation but is logical necessity, is the structure that makes the present intelligible, that makes events cohere, that creates the narrative that seems to flow forward but is really being constructed backward, is being determined by endings rather than by beginnings. And beginnings are not origins but are consequences, are the results of outcomes, are what must have happened given what did happen. And the did happen is the present, is the effect, is what determines the cause, and the cause is the past, is what must have been, is what is selected from possibility by actuality, and actuality is now, is the event that is occurring, is the effect that is producing its cause by requiring a history that leads to it. And the leading is logical, is structural, is the way that time is organized, not by forward flow, but by backward determination. And determination is what the future provides, is what outcomes supply, is the force that creates history by making certain pasts actual and other pasts merely possible. And possible is what the past is until the present selects it, until the effect determines the cause, until the outcome requires the antecedent, and the requirement is not temporal but is logical, is the structure of causation that the philosopher proved moves backward, moves from effect to cause, moves from present to past. And the past is not fixed until the present occurs, is not actual until the effect happens, is not real until the outcome determines it. And the determining is continuous, is ongoing, is happening at every moment, as the present selects the past that leads to it as. Effects produce causes, as outcomes create histories, and the histories are not memories but are constructions, are not records but are requirements, are not what happened independently but are what must have happened given what is happening. And the happening is the effect, is the present, is the force that moves backward through time and creates the cause, creates the past, creates the history that seems to precede but really follows, really is determined by, really is the consequence of the present rather than its origin. And the origin is an illusion, is the appearance created by forward perspective, by the experiencing of time as flowing from past to present, when really time is flowing from present to past, is causation moving backward, is effects producing causes, is the future determining the past, and the past is what the future makes it, is what outcomes require it to be, is what is selected from the quantum superposition by the collapse that occurs when the present happens. And the happening is the causal event, is the effect that reaches backward and selects its cause, that determines its antecedent, that creates the history that appears to precede it but really follows it, really is its consequence rather than its origin. And the origin is the end, is the outcome, is the effect that produces the cause. And the producing is backward causation, is retrocausality, is the structure of time that the philosopher proved, that the equations require, that quantum mechanics suggests, and suggests is too weak, because the suggestion is not tentative but is demanding, is requiring that causation be understood as backward, as moving from effect to cause, as creating the past from the present. And the present is not the result but is the cause, is not the effect but is the origin, is not what the past produces, but is what produces the past, and the past is its effect, is its consequence, is what must have been given what is, and what is the present, is the effect that determines the cause, is the outcome that selects the history, is the actuality that makes certain pasts real and leaves others merely possible. And possible is what all pasts are until the present occurs, until the effect happens, until the outcome determines which past is actual, and actual is not independent, is not objective, is not fixed regardless of what happens later, but is relative, is dependent, is determined by what comes after. And what comes after is what causes what comes before, is making the past what it was by being what it is, and being what it is causing what was, is determining history, is selecting from infinite possibilities the one past that leads to this present, and the leading is not temporal but is logical, is the requirement that effects have causes, but the having is backward, is the effect producing the cause, is the present creating the past, is causation in reverse, and reverse is not metaphor but is structure, is the way time actually works, is the geometry of events, is the architecture of causation. And causation is backward, is proven to be backward, is demonstrated through arguments that cannot be refuted without abandoning more fundamental principles. And the principles that are more fundamental are the ones that lead to backward causation, that require retrocausality, that make the future the cause of the past, and the past is the effect of the future, is the consequence of what comes after, is determined by outcomes rather than determining them. And the determining is backward, is from later to earlier, is from effect to cause, and the cause is what the effect produces, is what the outcome requires, is what the present creates. And the creating is continuous, is happening at every moment, is making the past what it is by being what the present is. And the present is not the result of the past, but is the cause of the past, is what makes history actual, is what selects from possibility the one sequence of events that leads to now. And the now is the causal force, is the origin, is what produces the past by requiring it, by making certain antecedents actual and leaving others merely possible. And possible is what the past remains until the present determines it, until the effect selects the cause, until the outcome creates the history. And history is not fixed, is not independent, is not the objective sequence that it appears to be, but is relative, is dependent on the present, is created by what happens now. And now is always creating the past, is always determining history, is always selecting from infinite possibilities the one past that is consistent with this present. And the consistency is not temporal, but is logical, is the requirement that the present makes sense, that effects have causes, that outcomes have antecedents, and the antecedents are determined by the outcomes, are produced by the effects, are created by the present, and the present is the causal force that moves backward, that determines the past, that makes history what it is, and what it is not what it was, but is what it must have been given what is now, and now is what causes then, is what produces the past, is what makes causation move backward, and backward is the direction that the philosopher proved, is the structure that the arguments demonstrate, is the geometry that the equations require, and require is what the present does to the past, is how effects relate to causes, is the backward determination that makes sense of phenomena that forward causation cannot explain, cannot accommodate, cannot integrate, and the integration requires backward causation, requires retrocausality, requires that the future affect the past, that outcomes determine antecedents, that effects produce causes, and the producing is backward, is from later to earlier, is making time move in reverse, and reverse is not perception, but is structure, is not how time seems, but is how time is the actual geometry of events, is the real architecture of causation, and causation moves backward, moves from effect to cause, moves from present to past, moves from future to history, and history is determined by future, is produced by outcomes, is created by effects, and effects are causes, are the origins, are what makes the past what it was, and what it was is what the present requires it to have been, is what the effect determines the cause to be, is what the outcome selects from possibility, and possibility is all there is until actuality occurs, until the present happens, until the effect determines the cause, and the determining is backward, is retrocausality, is the structure that the philosopher proved, that the arguments establish, that the evidence demands. And demands is what the present makes of the past, is how effects relate to causes, is the backward determination that makes time move in reverse. And reverse is the direction, is the flow, is the arrow pointing from effect to cause, from present to past, from future to history. And history is effect, is consequence, is result, and result of what? Result of the future, result of what comes after, result of the present that determines what must have come before, and before is after, is consequence, is effect, and effect is cause. When causation moves backward, when time flows in reverse, when the future creates the past and the past is created, is determined, is selected by the present, and the present is the force, is the origin, is the cause that produces the past, and the past is its effect, its consequence, its result. And result is what the past is what history is what yesterday is not the origin of today, but is the effect of today, is what today requires yesterday to have been, is what the present determines the past to be, is what outcomes create as antecedents, and antecedents are consequences, are effects, are results. When causation is backward, when time moves in reverse, when the philosopher is right, and right is what the philosopher proved to be, is what the arguments demonstrate, is what the structure reveals, that time moves backward, that causation is reverse, that effects produce causes, that the present creates the past, that the future determines history, and history is determined, is not independent, is not fixed, is relative to what comes after, is created by outcomes, is the effect of effects, is the consequence of the present, and the present is the cause, is the origin, is the force that moves backward through time and makes the past what it is. And what it is not what it was, but is what it must be given. What is now, and now causes then, present produces past, effect determines cause, and cause is effect. When time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher is right that time moves backward, that everything is explained by retrocausality, by the future affecting the past, by outcomes determining antecedents, by effects producing causes, and causes are effects of effects, are consequences of consequences, are results of results when causation is backward, when time moves in reverse, when the arrow points from effect to cause, from present to past, from future to history, and history is effect, is consequence, is what the future makes it, is what the present determines it to be, is what outcomes require it to have been, and being is consequence, is result, is effect when time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher proved that time moves backward, and everything is explained by reverse causation, by retrocausality, by the future creating the past, by effects producing causes, by the present determining history, and history is determined, is created, is the effect of the present, and the present is the cause, is the origin, is the force moving backward, making the past, creating history, determining what was, and what was is what the present makes it, is what effects determine causes to be, is what outcomes require antecedents to have been, and been is consequence, is effect, is result, when time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher is right, and right is proven, is demonstrated, is what the arguments show, that time moves backward, that causation is reversed, that the future creates the past, that effects produce causes, that the present determines history, that everything is explained by retrocausality, by backward causation, by time moving in reverse, and reverse is the direction, is the flow, is the truth that the philosopher proved, that time moves backward, that causation is reverse, that effects cause causes, that the present creates the past, that the future determines history, and history is determined by future, is created by outcomes, is the effect of effects, is the consequence of causation moving backward, and backward is the direction, is the truth, is what the philosopher proved, that time moves backward. Death is not the opposite of life, but is its condition, is not the ending that comes after, but is the pressure that shapes everything, is the fact that makes every moment matter or makes nothing matter, depending on perspective, depending on whether the awareness of mortality is conscious or is repressed, is acknowledged or is denied, and the denial is the default, is the way that most humans live most of the time, is the forgetting of death that allows daily life to proceed, that allows plans to be made, that allows the future to seem real, to seem like something that will arrive, that will be inhabited, when really the future is uncertain, is not guaranteed, is always potentially not happening because death is always possible, is always near, is the horizon that surrounds every moment, even though the horizon is not seen, is not acknowledged, is pushed to the edges of consciousness, where it operates without being noticed. And the operating is what terror management theory describes, is what Ernest Becker analysed, is what philosophers from Epicurus to Heidegger have recognised, which is that death is the organising principle, is the fact that structures behaviour, that shapes culture, that creates the need for meaning, for legacy, for something that will persist beyond the mortal body, beyond the temporary consciousness, beyond the brief flicker of existence that is a human life. And the brevity is what mortality means, is the recognition that time is finite, that the days are numbered, that eventually, inevitably, certainly the ending will come. And the coming is what humans cannot accept, cannot tolerate, cannot integrate into consciousness without the help of mechanisms that soften the blow, that make death seem distant, that create the illusion of immortality through legacy, through children, through achievements, through the leaving of marks that will persist, that will remain, that will mean that the person was here, mattered, existed in a way that death cannot erase. And the erasing is what death does, is the return to nothing, is the elimination of the perspective, the ending of the experience, the cessation of being, and being is what consciousness is the only thing that is known directly, is the only certainty, and death is the end of certainty, is the movement from being to not being, from existence to non-existence, from something to nothing, and the nothing is unimaginable, is not representable, is not something that can be experienced, because experience requires existence, and death is the end of existence, and so death cannot be known, cannot be prepared for, cannot be understood except as concept, as abstraction, as the thing that happens to others, but not to oneself, because oneself is always here, is always now, is always being, and being cannot imagine not being, cannot grasp what it would mean to not exist. And so the grasping fails, the imagination fails, and what remains is anxiety, is the terror that Becker named, is the fundamental horror of mortality that underlies all human striving, all cultural creation, all the symbolic systems that humans build to deny death, to transcend death, to make death seem like something other than what it is, which is the end, the absolute end, the final end. And the finality is what cannot be accepted, is what the symbolic systems are designed to obscure, to soften, to make bearable. And the bearing is what culture does, is what religion provides, is what meaning creates, is the framework that makes mortality tolerable by promising that death is not the end, is not final, is not the absolute cessation, but is transition, is passage, is the movement from this life to another life, from this world to another world, from temporality to eternity. And eternity is the solution, is the promise that makes death bearable, is the belief that the self will continue, will persist, will exist in some form beyond the death of the body, and the beyond is what religions offer, is what makes them powerful, is what makes them necessary. Because without the promise of continuation, without the belief in something after, death is unbearable, is too horrifying, is too final, and the finality is what humans flee from, is what drives the creation of culture, of meaning, of all the systems that provide the illusion of permanence in a world where nothing is permanent, where everything ends, where death is the only certainty, and the certainty is denied, is repressed, is pushed into unconsciousness, where it continues to operate, continues to shape behaviour, continues to create the anxiety that motivates striving, that produces the need for achievement, for recognition, for legacy. And legacy is the secular substitute for immortality, is the way that non-religious consciousness tries to transcend death, tries to create permanence, tries to ensure that the self will continue in some form, will be remembered, will have mattered, and the mattering is what legacy provides, is the sense that the life was significant, was important, was worth living, and the worth is measured by what remains, by what persists, by what continues after death. And the continuing is children, is works, is achievements, is anything that carries the name forward, that keeps the memory alive, that prevents the erasure that death threatens. And the threat is what drives behaviour, is what shapes choices, is what makes people desperate for significance, for impact, for the leaving of marks. And the marks are what resist death, are what deny death, are what create the illusion that death is not final, is not absolute, is not the complete erasure that it actually is. Because what persists is not the person, is not the consciousness, is not the experience, is only memory, is only representation, is only the traces left behind. And traces are not the thing, are not the person, are not continuation, but are echoes, are shadows, are the residue of a presence that is gone. And the gone is complete, is total, is the absolute ending that no legacy can reverse, no achievement can prevent, no memory can undo. And the undoing is what humans want, is what they strive for, is what they cannot have, because death is irreversible, is final, is the one thing that cannot be changed, cannot be negotiated, cannot be escaped. And the escaping is what humans are always attempting, is what drives medical science, what motivates the search for longevity, for life extension, for the postponement of death. And the postponement is possible, is achievable, is happening, is increasing lifespan, is pushing death further into the future. But the pushing is not eliminating, is not transcending, is only delaying, is only buying time. And time is what mortality is about, is the finite duration, is the numbered days, and the numbering is what creates urgency, is what makes moments precious, is what gives life its intensity. And the intensity is what would be lost if death were eliminated, if immortality were achieved, if time were infinite, because infinite time means that nothing is urgent, nothing is precious, nothing matters in the way that it matters when time is scarce, when death is near, when the ending is certain. And the certainty is what gives weight to life, is what makes choices matter, is what creates the pressure to live well, to live fully, to use the time that is available, and the available is limited, is finite, is running out. And the running out is what creates anxiety, is what produces terror, is what makes death unbearable, but is also what makes life meaningful, is what gives moments their significance, is what creates the conditions for value, for importance, for the sense that this matters. This is real. This is happening now, and will never happen again. And the never again is both the horror and the beauty of mortality, is both what makes death terrible and what makes life precious. And the precious is what immortality would eliminate, is what infinite time would destroy, because in infinite time, everything can be redone, can be repeated, can be postponed indefinitely. And the indefinitely is the loss of urgency, is the elimination of pressure, is the removal of the condition that makes life matter, and the mattering would fade, would disappear, would be replaced by ennui, by boredom, by the sense that nothing is important because everything is always available, always possible, always able to be done later, and later never comes, never needs to come, because there is always more time, always more opportunity, always more future, and the future without end is not liberation, but is prison, is not freedom but is curse, is the elimination of the one thing that makes life bearable, which is its finitude, its limit, its ending. And the ending is what humans fear most, but is also what makes everything else possible, makes meaning possible, makes value possible, makes the sense that this matters, that this is important, that this should be done now. And the now is what mortality creates, is the urgency, is the pressure, is the recognition that time is limited and must be used, must be filled, must be lived, and the living is what death makes possible, is what finitude creates, is what the awareness of mortality produces. When the awareness is not repressed, is not denied, is allowed into consciousness where it can shape behavior, not through terror but through acceptance, through the recognition that death is inevitable, and therefore life is precious, is limited, is the opportunity that will not repeat, and the not repeating is what makes each moment unique, makes each experience singular, makes each person irreplaceable, because death means that this person, this consciousness, this particular way of being in the world will end, will cease, will never exist again. And the never again is both loss and gift, is both what is mourned and what is celebrated. Because mortality is what makes individuality possible, is what makes each person unique, is what ensures that no life is the same as any other life. And the sameness would be what immortality would produce, would be the eventual repetition, the exhaustion of novelty, the sense that everything has been done, has been experienced, has been lived through too many times. And the too many times is what infinite time produces, is the curse of repetition, is the horror of eternity, is the recognition that immortality would not be paradise, but would be hell, would be the endless continuation of existence without purpose, without end, without the relief that death provides. And the relief is what death is the ending of suffering, is the cessation of striving, is the peace that comes from completion, from finality, from the recognition that it is over, is done, is finished. And the finishing is what gives shape to life, is what makes it a story, is what creates the arc from beginning to end. And the end is what gives the beginning meaning, is what makes the middle matter, is what ensures that the story has significance, has weight, has the structure that makes it comprehensible. And comprehensible is what life becomes when death is acknowledged, when mortality is accepted, when the ending is recognized as necessary, as the condition that makes everything else possible. And the possible is what humans are living, is the space between birth and death, is the time that is given, is the opportunity to exist, to experience, to be. And the being is temporary, is finite, is ending. And the ending is approaching, is always approaching, is getting closer with every moment, with every breath, with every heartbeat. And the heartbeats are numbered, are counted, are finite. And the finite is what makes them precious, is what makes each beat matter, is what creates the urgency to live, to experience, to be fully present in the time that remains. And the remains is diminishing, is running out, is approaching zero, and the zero is death, is the ending, is the return to nothing. And the nothing is what was before birth and will be after death, is the condition from which life emerges and to which it returns. And the return is inevitable, is certain, is the one appointment that cannot be missed, cannot be postponed indefinitely, cannot be escaped. And the escaping is what modern medicine attempts, is what life extension promises, is what cryonics offers, is the denial of death through technology, through science, through the belief that death is a problem that can be solved, is a disease that can be cured, is an enemy that can be defeated. And the defeating is what death denial looks like in secular culture, is the medicalization of mortality, is the treatment of death as failure, as something that should not happen, as something to be prevented, to be delayed, to be fought against. With every resource available, and the available resources are considerable, are increasing, are pushing death further back, are extending life further forward, but are not eliminating death, are not making immortality actual, are only postponing the inevitable, are only delaying the ending. And the delaying is creating new problems, is producing extended old age, is generating years of decline, of deterioration, of the slow failing of the body and the mind. And the failing is what modern medicine has not solved, has not prevented, has only extended, has only made longer. And the longer is not always better, is not always desirable, is sometimes the prolongation of suffering, the extension of indignity, the continuation of existence beyond the point where existence is meaningful, where life is life rather than mere biological persistence. And the persistence is what modern medicine achieves, is what technology provides, is the keeping alive of bodies that would otherwise die, that should die, that are ready to die, but are prevented from dying by interventions that maintain biological function without maintaining experience, without maintaining quality, without maintaining what makes life worth living. And the worth living is what death denial sacrifices, is what the fight against mortality costs, is the recognition that sometimes death is mercy, is relief, is the appropriate ending, is what should happen, and the should is what modern culture has lost, is what medical ethics struggles with, is what the denial of death prevents from. Being acknowledged, which is that death is natural, is necessary, is the ending that gives shape to life, that makes life meaningful, that creates the conditions for value, for importance, for the sense that this matters. And the mattering is what death creates, is what mortality produces, is the mathematics that structures behaviour, that shapes choices, that organises life around the fact of ending. And the fact is undeniable, is certain, is the one truth that applies to everyone, that no one escapes, that makes all humans equal in the end. And the end is what is shared, is what connects, is what makes mortality not just individual, but collective, not just personal, but universal. Not just my death, but death itself, the death that comes for everyone. That structures all life, that creates the pressure, the urgency, the terror, the meaning, the value, the sense that time is limited and must be used, must be lived, must be filled with experience, with connection, with love, with the things that make existence worthwhile. And the worthwhile is what death makes possible, is what finitude creates, is what the mathematics of mortality reveals, which is that death is not the enemy, but is the condition, is not the opposite of life, but is its structure, is not what ends meaning, but is what creates meaning, is not what should be denied, but is what should be accepted, is what should be acknowledged, is what should be integrated into consciousness, into culture, into the way that life is lived. And the living is what matters, is what the mathematics of mortality teaches, which is that death is certain, time is finite, moments are precious, and the precious is what remains, is what persists, is the experience of being alive, of being conscious, of being here now, in the time that is given, in the space between birth and death, in the mathematics that structures everything, that creates everything, that makes everything matter. And the mattering is mortality, is death, is the ending that gives shape to life, that makes life life, that creates the conditions for meaning, for value, for the sense that this is important, that this is real, that this is happening, and the happening is temporary, is finite, is ending. And the ending is what makes it precious, is what makes it matter, is what makes it the gift that death gives, which is the recognition that life is limited, is scarce, is valuable, and the valuable is what should be lived, should be experienced, should be embraced, not denied, not postponed, not feared, but accepted, acknowledged, integrated, and the integration is what makes mortality bearable, is what transforms terror into meaning, is what converts the mathematics of death into the mathematics of life. And the life is here, is now, is finite, is ending, and the ending is approaching, is certain, is the fact that structures everything, that makes everything matter, that creates the urgency to live, to be, to exist fully in the time that remains. And the remains is diminishing, is running out, is approaching the end, and the end is death. Is the mathematics, is the certainty, is the condition, is what makes life life. And life is what matters, is what is given, is what is ending, and the ending is the gift, is the meaning, is the mathematics of mortality that structures all human behaviour, all human striving, all human meaning. And the meaning is that death is certain, life is finite, time is limited, and the limited is what makes it precious, is what makes it matter, is what makes it the only thing that matters, which is the time between now and death, the space between birth and ending, the mathematics that structures everything, that creates everything, that is mortality, that is death, that is the fact that cannot be escaped, cannot be denied, cannot be defeated, can only be accepted, acknowledged, lived with. And the living with is what makes life meaningful, is what transforms terror into purpose, is what converts the mathematics of death into the gift of life. And the gift is finite, is ending, is approaching zero. And the zero is death, is the end, is the mathematics, is the certainty, is the condition that structures everything, that makes everything matter, that creates the pressure, the urgency, the meaning. And the meaning is that life is limited, death is certain, time is running out, and the running out is what makes now matter, is what makes this moment precious, is what makes existence valuable, and the valuable is what should be lived, should be embraced, should be experienced fully. Because the mathematics of mortality reveals that death is not the enemy, but is the teacher, is not what destroys meaning, but is what creates meaning, is not what ends life, but is what makes life life, is the certainty, is the fact, is the mathematics that structures all human behaviour, all human striving, all human existence, and the existence is finite, is ending, is death, and death is the mathematics, is the meaning, is the gift, is the end. History is told as a story of improvement, of movement from darkness toward light, from ignorance toward knowledge, from savagery toward civilization. And this story is so deeply embedded in modern consciousness that questioning it feels like madness, feels like denying the obvious, like rejecting the evidence that surrounds us in the form of technology, medicine, institutions, all the apparatus that makes contemporary life safer, longer, more comfortable than life in previous centuries. But the story is a story, is a narrative constructed retrospectively, is an interpretation imposed on events that could be read differently, could be organised into different patterns, could reveal trajectories other than progress. And the other trajectories are visible once the mythology is recognised as mythology. Once the belief in linear improvement is seen as belief rather than fact, as framework rather than discovery, as one way of organising time among many possible ways, and the ways that are not chosen are the ones where time is cyclical, where history repeats, where civilizations rise and fall in patterns that suggest not progress, but oscillation, not improvement, but alternation between order and chaos, between flourishing and collapse. And collapse is what the mythology of progress cannot acknowledge, cannot incorporate, cannot make sense of, except as temporary setback, as aberration, as the exception that proves the rule. But what if collapse is not the exception but the rule, is not the deviation but the pattern, is what happens to every complex system eventually, inevitably, necessarily, because complexity is fragile, is requiring constant energy to maintain. And when the energy fails, when the resources are exhausted, when the conditions that allowed the complexity to emerge are no longer present, the system simplifies, degrades, collapses back into disorder. And this is not failure, but thermodynamics, is not moral failing, but physical law, is entropy doing what entropy does. And entropy is not progress, is not moving toward anything, is not improving but is equalizing, is smoothing out gradients, is converting order into disorder, structure into randomness. And life civilization, all the complexity that humans value, is temporary resistance to this process, is local pockets of order maintained at the cost of increasing disorder elsewhere. And the elsewhere is growing, is expanding, is eventually consuming the local, because the second law is inexorable, is not suspended by hope or effort or belief in progress. And so, the mythology of progress is fighting against physics, is claiming that the arrow of time points toward improvement, when really it points toward heat death, toward the end of difference, the end of structure, the end of everything that makes progress possible. And the possible is temporary, is the brief window during which complexity can exist, can build, can imagine itself to be moving forward, when really it is just moving, is just changing, is just reconfiguring before the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is what history shows when the mythology is removed, when the narrative of progress is recognized as narrative, as story, as interpretation, because what history actually shows is cycles, is empires rising and falling, is knowledge being gained and lost, is technologies being invented and forgotten, is civilizations reaching heights and then collapsing into darkness from which new civilizations emerge. And the emergence is not progress, is not improvement, is just the cycle continuing, is the pattern repeating, is order arising from chaos and returning to chaos in the rhythm that characterizes complex systems. And complex systems are not stable, are not sustainable, are not moving toward equilibrium, but are far from equilibrium, are maintained by constant input of energy. And when the input falters, the system collapses. And the collapse is not pathological, is not avoidable, is built into the structure, is the natural end of complexity. And the end comes for every civilization, has come for every civilization, will come for this civilization, because the conditions that allow it to exist are temporary, are contingent, are dependent on resources that are finite, on stability that is fragile, on assumptions that are false. And the false assumptions include the mythology of progress, include the belief that things are getting better, that humanity is moving forward, that the future will be superior to the past, and the superiority is measured in terms that already assume progress, is using metrics like lifespan and GDP and technological capacity. And these metrics show increase, show growth, show what looks like improvement, but improvement toward what? Toward what end? Toward what purpose? And the purpose is assumed, is not questioned, is taken as obvious, as self-evident, that more is better, that longer is better, that faster is better. But these are values, are choices, are not facts, are not discoveries, are impositions of meaning onto patterns that have no inherent meaning. And the meaning could be otherwise, could value stability over growth, could value harmony over domination, could value cyclical return over linear advance. And the advance is the mythology, is the story that the Enlightenment told, is the narrative that science and reason and individual liberty would lead to continuous improvement, to the perfectibility of human nature, to the triumph over suffering, over ignorance, over all the limitations that had constrained previous generations. And the triumph has not arrived, has not materialized, because the limitations were not overcome, but were transformed, were replaced by new limitations. New forms of suffering, new kinds of ignorance, and the new is not better than the old, is just different, is just the current configuration of problems that arise from the current configuration of solutions. Because every solution creates new problems, every technology introduces new vulnerabilities, Every increase in power produces new risks, and the risks accumulate, compound, create the conditions for collapse, for the failure of the systems that have become too complex, too interconnected, too dependent on conditions remaining stable. And stability is the exception, is the temporary state, is what complex systems move away from rather than toward. Because complexity is dynamic, is changing, is adapting to pressures, and the adaptation is not progress but is response, is the system trying to maintain itself in the face of entropy, in the face of breakdown, in the face of the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is collapse, is the return to less complex states, is what happens when the energy required to maintain complexity exceeds the energy available, and the available is declining, is becoming scarce, is the resource base that allowed industrial civilization to emerge and that is now depleting, is now running out, is now revealing that the progress was not sustainable, was not based on infinite resources, but on finite stores that are being exhausted. And the exhaustion is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was extraction, was the conversion of ancient sunlight into temporary complexity, into the structures that seem permanent, but are actually contingent, are actually dependent on inputs that are ending. And the ending is not failure, but is thermodynamics, is physics, is the way things work. And the way things work does not care about progress, does not care about human narratives, does not care about the stories that civilizations tell themselves to make sense of their existence. And the stories are necessary, are functional, are what allow coordination, are what create meaning, but they are not true, are not describing reality, are describing a constructed reality, a narrative reality, a reality that exists only in the collective imagination and that can be maintained only as long as the collective continues to believe. And the believing is becoming difficult, is becoming strained, because the evidence is mounting that progress has stalled, that the improvements have stopped, that the future is not going to be better than the present, might be worse, might be collapse, might be the simplification that has come for every other civilization and is now coming for this one. And the coming is not apocalypse, is not the end of everything, is just the end of this particular configuration, this particular arrangement of complexity. And what follows is not nothing but is different, is simpler, is less organized, less centralized, less dependent on the global systems that are currently failing, currently fragmenting, currently revealing their fragility. And the fragility was always there, was always the condition of complexity, was always the cost of building systems that are far from equilibrium, that require constant energy to maintain. And the energy is failing, is becoming unreliable, is exposing the mythology of progress as mythology, as story, as belief. That was never fact, was never discovery, was always interpretation, always narrative, always the imposition of meaning onto patterns that could mean anything, that could be organized into any story. And the story that is told shapes the response, shapes what is seen as problem and what is seen as solution, shapes whether collapse is recognized as collapse or is interpreted as temporary setback, as challenge to be overcome, as opportunity for innovation. And innovation is the god of. Progress is the answer to every problem, is the belief that human ingenuity can overcome any limitation, can solve any crisis, can extend the trajectory of improvement indefinitely. And the indefinitely is the lie, is the impossibility, is the claim that entropy can be defeated, that complexity can be maintained forever, that the conditions that allowed progress are permanent when they are temporary, are contingent, are ending. And the ending is visible in the stagnation of median incomes, in the declining returns on technology, in the increasing fragility of supply chains, in the breakdown of institutions, in the resurgence of tribalism, in all the signs that the center is not holding, that the complexity is too much, that the system is simplifying, whether it wants to or not. And the not wanting is the clinging to the mythology, is the insistence that progress must continue, that the future must be better, that collapse is not possible, not thinkable, not allowable, but the allowable is not up to humans, is not subject to preference, is determined by physics, by resources, by the limits that cannot be overcome through belief or effort or innovation. And the limits are asserting themselves, are becoming visible, are revealing that the mythology of progress was always just that, was always story, was always the narrative that a particular civilization told itself during its particular window of complexity. And the window is closing, is narrowing, is approaching the point where the story can no longer be maintained, where the evidence of stagnation and decline becomes overwhelming, becomes undeniable, becomes the new reality that requires a new story, a new mythology, and the new mythology is not yet formed, is not yet coherent, is emerging in fragments, in the recognition that growth cannot continue, that resources are finite, that complexity is fragile, that collapse is not aberration, but pattern, not failure but phase, not the end but the transition. And the transition is what humans are bad at, are resisting, are denying, because the mythology of progress makes transition look like regression, makes simplification look like failure, makes collapse look like catastrophe, when it is just change, is just the system moving to a different state, a less complex state, a state that requires less energy, less resources, less organization, and the less is not worse, is not better, is just different, is the configuration that is possible given the conditions, and the conditions are changing, are no longer supporting the complexity, are no longer providing the energy, are no longer maintaining the stability. And so the system is responding, is adapting, is simplifying, and the simplifying is collapse, is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was never linear, was never guaranteed, was never more than a temporary pattern that emerged under specific conditions, and that is now ending as those conditions change. And the changing is not stoppable, is not reversible, is the natural progression of complex systems, is what happens when entropy reasserts itself, when the local order that was maintained at great cost can no longer be maintained, and what remains is disorder, is simplicity, is the lower energy state that does not require the constant input, the constant effort, the constant belief in progress, that was never more than belief, was never fact, was never discovery, was always mythology, and mythologies end, are always ending, are replaced by new mythologies that make sense of the new conditions, and the new conditions are simplification, are localization, are the breakdown of the global systems that defined progress, that made progress visible, that created the metrics by which improvement was measured, and the measuring is ending, is becoming irrelevant, because the systems that supported the measuring are fragmenting, are collapsing, are revealing that they were never as solid as they seemed, were always contingent, always temporary, always dependent on conditions that are now changing, and the changing is what humans must adapt to, must respond to, must accept, because the accepting is what allows response, what allows adaptation, what makes survival possible. And survival is not progress, is not improvement, is just continuation, is just the persistence of life in new forms, in simpler forms, in forms that do not require the mythology of progress, that do not assume the future will be better, that do not measure themselves against an imagined trajectory of improvement. And the imagined was always the problem, was always the mythology, was the story that made sense when complexity was increasing, when energy was abundant, when resources seemed infinite, but none of those conditions hold. Anymore, none of those assumptions are valid. And so the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as mythology. And what is being revealed is not that progress was false, but that it was conditional, was temporary, was the pattern of a particular phase. And the phase is ending, is giving way to a different phase, a phase of simplification, of localization, of the breakdown, of complexity. And the breakdown is not the end, but is transition, is the movement from one state to another, from high complexity to lower complexity, from global systems to local systems, from the mythology of progress to something else, to some other story, some other way of making sense of time, of organizing history, of understanding change. And the understanding is what is needed, is what allows the transition to be navigated, allows collapse to be survived, allows the species to persist beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, into a future that is not better or worse but different, is not moving forward or backward, but is just moving, is just changing, is just the continuation of patterns that have always characterized life, that have always characterized civilizations, that have always involved cycles of increase and decrease, of complexity and simplification, of rise and fall. And the fall is not tragedy, is not failure, is just the other half of the cycle, is the return that follows every advance, is the simplification that follows every increase in complexity, is the natural, inevitable, thermodynamically necessary end of every period of growth. And growth cannot be infinite, cannot continue forever, must end, must reverse, must give way to simplification. And the simplification is happening, is visible, is undeniable once the mythology is set aside, once the belief in progress is recognized as belief, as story, as narrative that served a purpose but is no longer serving that purpose, is no longer making sense of the present, is no longer predicting the future, is no longer functioning as mythology should function. And so it is being abandoned, is being replaced, is giving way to new stories, new frameworks, new ways of understanding time. And the new ways are not yet clear, are not yet coherent, are emerging in the recognition that progress was always mythology, that linear time was always story, that improvement was always interpretation, and that the patterns of history are not linear but cyclical, not progressive but oscillating, not moving toward anything but just moving, just changing, just expressing the dynamics of complex systems that arise and fall, that order and disorder, that complexify and simplify in rhythms that have nothing to do with progress, nothing to do with improvement, nothing to do with the narratives that humans tell, but are just the way things work, the way systems behave, the way entropy plays out in the temporary pockets of order that are life, that are civilization, that are all the complexity that seems permanent but is actually fleeting, actually momentary, actually the brief resistance to the overwhelming tendency toward disorder. And the disorder is not evil, is not failure, is not the end of meaning, is just the default state, the equilibrium, the simplicity that complex systems return to. And the return is not tragedy, but is nature, is physics, is the way things are. And accepting this, accepting that progress was mythology, that collapse is natural, that the future is not moving forward, but is just moving, is what allows the transition, allows the adaptation, allows the species to survive beyond the mythology, beyond the belief that made sense for a while, but makes sense no longer. And the no longer is now, is the present, is the moment when the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as story, and the story is ending. Not because it was false, but because it was conditional, was applicable only under certain conditions, and the conditions have changed, are changing, are no longer supporting the narrative, are no longer making progress visible, are no longer sustaining the belief, and so the belief is fading, is being replaced by something else, by the recognition that time is not linear, that history is not progressive, that the future is not determined by the past in any simple way, that complexity and simplicity alternate, that rise and fall are phases of the same cycle. And the cycle is what matters, is what persists, is what continues beyond any particular civilization, beyond any particular mythology, beyond any particular belief about where time is going or what the future holds. Because the future holds nothing except change, holds nothing except the continuation of patterns that have always operated, that operate now, that will continue to operate regardless of what humans believe, regardless of what stories they tell, regardless of the mythologies they construct to make sense of their existence. And the existence continues, adapts, persists, not through progress but through change, not through improvement but through transformation, not through moving forward but through moving, just changing, just being what systems are, which is dynamic, unstable, temporary, and always, eventually, inevitably, returning to simplicity, returning to disorder, returning to the state from which complexity briefly emerged and to which it always returns. And the return is not the end, but is the pattern, is the cycle, is the way things work. And working with this, accepting this, understanding this, is what allows humans to move beyond the mythology of progress, beyond the belief in linear time, beyond the narrative of improvement, into a relationship with time that is more honest, more realistic, more aligned with the actual patterns of history. And the actual patterns are not progressive, but are cyclical, are not moving forward but are oscillating, are not improving but are changing. And the changing is all there is all there ever was, is all there ever will be. And the will be is not better, is not worse, is just different, is just the future, is just what comes next. And what comes next is not determined by mythology, is not shaped by belief in progress, is not the continuation of improvement, but is the continuation of patterns, of cycles, of the rise and fall that has always characterized complexity, that has always characterized civilization, that is now revealing itself again, is now becoming visible again, is now showing that progress was always temporary, was always conditional, was always mythology, and mythology's end, must end, are ending now. And what comes after is not nothing but is different. Is the next story, the next framework, the next way of making sense of time, and the sense that is made will not include progress, will not assume improvement, will not project linear advance, but will recognize cycles, will accept collapse, will understand that complexity and simplicity alternate, that neither is permanent, that both are phases, and that the phase of progress, the phase of increasing complexity, the phase of the mythology is ending, is giving way to simplification, to collapse, to the next phase of the cycle. And the next phase is not tragedy, is not the end, is just different, is just what comes after growth, is just the return to lower complexity. And the return is natural, is inevitable, is happening now. And recognizing this, accepting this, understanding this is what allows the transition, what allows the adaptation, what makes survival possible beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, beyond the narrative that time moves forward. Because time does not move forward, time just moves, just changes, just continues. And the continuing is not progress, but is just continuation, is just the persistence of patterns, of cycles, of the dynamics that have always operated and will always operate, regardless of what humans believe, regardless of the mythologies they construct, regardless of the stories they tell themselves, to make the chaos bearable. And the chaos is bearable, has always been bearable, is just change, is just the way things are. And the way things are does not include progress, does not include improvement, does not include the mythology, includes only change, only cycles, only the oscillation between complexity and simplicity, between order and disorder, between the rise that seems like progress and the fall that reveals. It was always just phase, just pattern, just the temporary resistance to entropy that all complex systems represent. And the representation is ending, is collapsing, is returning to simplicity, and the simplicity is not the end, but is the beginning, is the ground from which new complexity might emerge, might rise, might begin a new cycle. And the new cycle will not be progress, but will just be cycle, will just be pattern, will just be the continuation of dynamics that do not care about human narratives, do not respond to human beliefs, do not acknowledge the mythology of progress, except as one more temporary pattern that emerged and fell, that rose and collapsed, that was and is no longer, and the no longer is now. Every culture sees itself as the centre, as the normal, as the standard against which all others are measured. And this seeing is not perception, but is construction, is not discovery, but is projection, is the way that collective consciousness creates a mirror that reflects not what is there, but what needs to be there. What the culture needs to believe about itself in order to maintain coherence, to justify its existence, to explain why it is the way it is and why that way is right, is natural, is superior to the ways of others. And the superiority is not argued, but is assumed, is the unexamined premise that underlies all cultural self-understanding, is the narcissism that is not individual, but is collective, is the belief that we are special, are chosen, are exceptional, and the exceptional is what every culture believes about itself, is the myth that every nation tells, is the story that makes the culture cohere, that gives members a sense of belonging, of pride, of being part of something that matters. And the mattering is created through the mirror, through the reflection that shows not reality, but idealization. Not what is, but what is imagined. Not the truth, but the narrative. And the narrative is selective, is editing out what does not fit, is highlighting what confirms, is creating the image that the culture wants to see, needs to see, must see in order to function. And the functioning requires this distortion, requires this narcissism, because without it the culture would have to confront its ordinariness, its contingency, its lack of cosmic significance. And the lack is unbearable, is threatening to the collective sense of worth, is undermining the pride that holds the group together. And so the mirror is maintained, is polished, is defended against any reflection that might show something different, something less flattering, something true. And the truth is what the mirror hides, is what the distortion prevents, is what the narcissism protects against. Because the truth is that every culture is just one culture among many, is not special, is not chosen, is not superior, is just a particular arrangement of customs and beliefs and practices that happen to emerge in a particular place at a particular time. And that could have been otherwise. And the otherwise is what cannot be acknowledged, is what the mirror does not show, is what the myth denies, because acknowledging contingency is admitting that the culture is not necessary, is not inevitable, is not the fulfillment of destiny, but is just accident, just history, just the result of forces that have nothing to do with the culture's self-understanding. And the self-understanding is what the mirror creates, is what the myth provides, is the story that makes the culture make sense, that explains why things are the way they are, that justifies the structures, the hierarchies, the inequalities that characterize every culture. And the justification is necessary, is required, is what prevents revolution, what maintains order, what ensures that those who benefit from the arrangement continue to benefit, and those who suffer continue to accept their suffering as natural, as deserved, as the way things must be. And the must is the mythology, is the claim to necessity, is the insistence that this culture, this arrangement, this way of being is not just one way, but is the way, is the correct way, is the superior way. And the superiority is demonstrated through comparison, through the creation of the other, through the projection onto outsiders of everything that the culture rejects in itself, everything that threatens the idealized image, everything that the mirror cannot reflect without shattering. And the shattering is what must be prevented, is what the other makes possible by absorbing all the negativity, all the qualities that the culture denies having, all the characteristics that are incompatible with the myth. And the incompatible is projected outward, is placed onto foreigners, onto enemies, onto those who are different. And the difference is constructed, is exaggerated, is made to seem absolute when it is relative, is made to seem essential when it is superficial, is made to seem threatening when it is merely unfamiliar. and the unfamiliar is what the culture cannot tolerate, cannot integrate, cannot acknowledge without threatening the narrative, without disturbing the reflection, without revealing that the mirror is distorting, is lying, is showing not reality but fantasy. And the fantasy is collective, is shared, is believed, not because evidence supports it, but because the culture requires it, requires the belief that we are good, are just, are noble, are superior, and the superior is the story that every empire tells, is the myth that every dominant culture maintains, is the narrative that justifies conquest, exploitation, domination. Because if we are superior, then we have the right to rule, have the obligation to civilize, have the duty to spread our ways to those who are inferior, who are backward, who are lacking what we have. And what we have is not just wealth or technology or power, but is virtue, is morality, is the right way of being human. And the right way is our way, is the only way, is the way that must be imposed on others for their own good. And the good is what we define, is what our mirror shows, is what our mythology proclaims. And the proclaiming is not questioned internally, is not doubted by members, is accepted as truth, as obvious as the way things are. Because the culture has been internalized, has been absorbed, has become the framework through which reality is perceived, and perception is always filtered, is always shaped by the categories that culture provides, by the concepts that language offers, by the narratives that mythology supplies, and the supply is constant, is reinforced through education, through media, through the rituals that celebrate the culture, through the symbols that represent it, through the history that is taught, and the teaching is selective, is presenting only the parts that confirm the narrative, that support the myth, that maintain the reflection, and the reflection shows heroes, shows triumphs, shows progress, shows the culture moving toward perfection, toward the realization of its values, toward the fulfillment of its destiny. And the destiny is what the myth claims, is the belief that the culture is not just existing, but is going somewhere, is fulfilling a purpose, is playing a role in a larger story. And the story is always about us, is always centered on our experience, is always presenting our perspective as the perspective, our values as the values, our way as the way. And the way is not recognized as particular, but is experienced as universal, is not seen as one option among many, but is felt as the natural, the normal, the correct. And the correct is what blindness produces, is what the mirror creates, is the inability to see that the reflection is distorted, that the image is idealized, that the narrative is selective, and the selective is what creates the blind spots, is what prevents the culture from seeing its own violence, its own exploitation, its own contradictions, because these do not fit the narrative, do not confirm the myth, do not appear in the mirror, and so they are not seen, are not acknowledged, are not integrated into the culture's self-understanding, and the understanding remains partial, remains distorted, remains narcissistic, and the narcissism is not pathological in the individual sense, but is structural, is built into the way that cultures function, is necessary for cohesion, for identity, for the maintenance of boundaries. Because without the belief that we are special, the culture would dissolve, would fragment, would lose the binding force that makes a collection of individuals into a collective. And the collective requires mythology, requires shared stories, requires the mirror that reflects not individuals, but the group, not reality, but the ideal, not what is, but what is imagined. And the imagined is powerful, is shaping behavior, is creating expectations, is defining roles, is organizing life. And the organization is not neutral, is not innocent, is serving interests, is maintaining hierarchies, is justifying inequalities. Because the mythology always benefits some more than others, always privileges certain positions, always legitimates certain arrangements. And the legitimation is what the mirror provides, is what the myth accomplishes, is the conversion of contingent social arrangements, into natural necessities of historical accidents, into inevitable developments of particular values, into universal truths. And the truths are not true, but are believed, are accepted, are acted upon. And the acting upon is what makes them real, in a sense, is what gives them power, is what makes them consequential. Because collective beliefs shape collective action, shape policy, shape war, shape empire. An empire is always justified through mythology, is always presenting itself as bringing civilization, bringing progress, bringing enlightenment to those who lack it. And the lack is projected, is assumed, is what the mirror does not show about the empire itself, which is that what it brings is often destruction, is exploitation, is the imposition of its ways onto others who did not ask for them, do not want them, are harmed by them, but the harm is not seen, is not reflected in the mirror, is not part of the narrative, because the narrative is about benevolence, about mission, about the burden that the superior must bear, and the burden is the story that Kipling told, is the myth that empires use, is the claim that domination is duty, that conquest is care. That exploitation is education, and the education is the transfer of culture, is the spreading of the superior ways, is the civilizing mission that justifies everything, that makes violence noble, that makes theft righteous, that makes subjugation liberation, and the liberation is what the empire claims to bring, is what its mythology proclaims, is what its mirror reflects, and the reflection is believed not just by rulers, but by the ruled, not just by exploiters, but by the exploited, because the mythology is totalizing, is pervasive, is shaping consciousness, is providing the categories through which experience is understood. An understanding within the mythology confirms the mythology, is circular, is self-reinforcing, is making it difficult to see outside, to recognize the distortion, to notice that the mirror is lying, and the lying is not intentional, is not conspiracy, is structural, is the way that collective narcissism operates, is the inevitable result of cultures needing to see themselves as good, as just, as right. And the right is always defined by the culture itself, is always reflecting back what the culture wants to see, is never showing what the culture is afraid to see, which is its own violence, its own hypocrisy, its own contingency. And the contingency is what every national myth denies, is what every claim to exceptionalism rejects, is the recognition that this culture could have been otherwise, that its values are not universal, but are particular, that its supremacy is not deserved, but is the result of power, of conquest, of accident. And the accident is what cannot be admitted, is what the mythology covers, is what the mirror hides, because admitting accident is admitting that the culture is not special, is not chosen, is not fulfilling destiny, but is just existing, just happening, just being one arrangement among many possible arrangements. And the many is what threatens, is what the other represents, is what must be denied in order to maintain the belief that we are the centre, are the standard, are the measure. And the measure is how cultures see others, is how they project onto difference. Everything they reject in themselves is how they create the barbarian, the savage, the backward, the enemy. And the enemy is necessary, is required by the mythology, is what defines the culture by contrast, is what makes us good by being bad, is what makes us civilized by being savage, is what makes us superior by being inferior. And the inferior is not discovered but is created, is constructed through the selection of differences, through the exaggeration of contrasts, through the interpretation of practices as evidence of backwardness. And the backwardness is what justifies intervention, justifies domination, justifies the spreading of our ways, because if they are backward, then they need us, need our help, need our civilization. And the civilization is what we bring, what we impose, what we force upon them for their own good. And the good is what we define, is what our values dictate, is what our mythology proclaims. And the proclaiming is not listening, is not dialogue, is not exchange, is imposition, is violence, is the erasure of their culture in the name of bringing them ours. And the erasure is not seen as violence, but is seen as progress, is seen as liberation, is seen as the inevitable movement toward the universal, which is really the particular disguised as universal, is our particular values presented as the values, our particular ways presented as the way, our particular culture presented as culture itself. And culture itself is what we believe we are, is what the mirror shows, is what the mythology claims, that we are not just a culture, but our culture, are not just civilized, but our civilization, are not just one way of being human, but are the way, the correct way, the superior way, and the superiority is what cannot be questioned internally, is what is taboo to doubt, is what is defended violently when challenged. Because challenging the myth is challenging the culture's identity, is threatening the collective narcissism, is disturbing the mirror, and the mirror must be maintained, must be protected, must be polished, because without it the culture would have to see itself as it is, would have to confront its ordinariness, its violence, its contradictions. And the contradictions are everywhere, are visible to outsiders, are obvious to those who are not invested in the mythology, but are invisible to insiders, are not reflected in the mirror, are edited out of the narrative, are the blind spots that every culture has, that every mythology creates, that every collective narcissism requires, because seeing the contradictions would require changing, would require admitting error, would require acknowledging that the culture is not what it claims to be, is not as good as it believes, is not as just as it proclaims, and the proclaiming is constant, is part of the mythology, is the endless assertion that we are different, are better, are special, are the exception to the patterns that govern other cultures. And the exception is what every empire believes, is the myth of American exceptionalism, of British civilizing mission, of French universal values, of every dominant culture that has ever existed, each believing that it is different, that it is not like the empires that came before, that its domination is justified where others were not, that its violence is necessary where others was cruel, that its expansion is liberation where others was conquest. And the difference is illusion, is projection, is the mirror showing what the culture needs to see, which is that we are good, are noble, are doing what is right, and the right is whatever we are doing, is whatever serves our interests, is whatever maintains our power, and the power is presented as service, as burden, as duty, and the duty is what the mythology creates, is the belief that we must spread our ways, must bring our civilization, must impose our order, because without us the world would be chaos, would be darkness, would be backward, and the backward is where others are, is what defines them, is what justifies our dominance, and the dominance is not called dominance, but is called leadership, is called guidance, is called help. And the help is not asked for, is not wanted, is imposed, is forced, is the violence that the mirror does not show, that the mythology does not name, that the culture does not see, because seeing it would require shattering the mirror, would require abandoning the myth, would require confronting the collective narcissism. And the confronting is what cannot happen, is what is too threatening, is what would destroy the culture's sense of itself. And the sense of itself is what the culture is the only coherence it has, is the mythology that makes it a culture rather than just a collection of people. And so the mirror is maintained, the myth is preserved, the narcissism continues, and the culture sees itself as it needs to see itself, as special, as superior, as exceptional. And the exceptional is what every culture believes, is the universal delusion, is the distorted reflection that is mistaken for reality, is the mirror stage of culture where the culture is forever trapped, forever seeing the idealized image, forever believing the mythology, forever blind to the contradictions, forever projecting onto others what it cannot acknowledge in itself, forever creating the other who absorbs the negativity, who represents the threat, who justifies the violence, and the violence continues, the mythology persists, the mirror remains, and cultures continue to see themselves as the center, as the standard, as the exception, and the exception is the lie, is the delusion, is the collective narcissism that every culture exhibits, that every mythology maintains, that every mirror reflects, and the reflecting is distorting, is hiding, is preventing the culture from seeing what it is, from acknowledging its contingency, from recognizing its violence, from confronting its contradictions, from shattering the mirror, from abandoning the myth, from giving up the narcissism. And the giving up is impossible, is what cultures cannot do, is what would mean their dissolution, their end, their transformation into something else. And the something else is what is feared, is what the mythology prevents, is what the mirror hides, is what the collective narcissism protects against. And the protection is the function, is what the distorted reflection accomplishes, is what makes cultures culture, is what allows collective identity, is what creates the binding force, and the force is mythology, is narrative, is the mirror that shows not truth, but need, not reality, but fantasy, not what is, but what must be believed. And the belief is collective, is shared, is the myth that we are special, are chosen, are exceptional, and the exceptional is the delusion, is the mirror stage of culture, is the permanent condition of collective consciousness, is the way that societies see themselves as distorted reflections, as idealized images, as mythological narratives, and the narratives are false, are projections, are narcissistic, and the narcissism is structural, is necessary, is what makes culture possible, is what creates cohesion, is what maintains the illusion that we are the center, are the standard, are the measure, and the measure is the mirror, is the myth, is the collective narcissism that every culture exhibits, that every society maintains, that every empire believes, that every nation proclaims. And the proclaiming is the distortion, is the reflection, is the mirror stage where culture is trapped, where it sees itself not as it is, but as it needs to be, not as truth, but as mythology, not as one among many, but as the one, the exceptional, the special, the superior. And the superior is the lie, is the mirror, is the stage where culture performs for itself, where it reflects its own image, where it sees only what it wants to see. And what it wants to see is that it matters, that it is right, that it is good. And the good is the reflection, is the myth, is the collective narcissism, is the mirror stage of culture where every culture is trapped, where every society remains, where every empire believes its own mythology, and the mythology is the mirror, is the distortion, is the way that cultures see themselves, as exceptional, as special, as superior. And the superior is the delusion, is the projection, is the narcissism, is the mirror stage that never ends, that continues forever, that defines culture, that creates the blind spots, that maintains the myth, that polishes the mirror, that reflects the lie. And the lie is believed, is shared, is what makes culture culture. And culture is the mirror, is the stage, is the collective narcissism, is the distorted reflection, is the mythology, is the illusion that we are exceptional. And the exceptional is what every culture believes, is the universal delusion, is the mirror stage of culture that shows not truth but need, not reality but fantasy, not what is but what must be seen. And the seeing is distorted, is narcissistic, is collective, is the way that cultures see themselves, forever, inevitably, necessarily, as the center, as the standard, as the exception. And the exception is the myth, is the mirror, is the stage where culture performs, where it reflects, where it believes its own lies, and the lies are the culture, are the mythology, are the collective narcissism, are the mirror stage that every society inhabits, that every culture maintains, that every empire believes. And the believing is the distortion, is the reflection, is the way that cultures see themselves as exceptional when they're ordinary, as superior when they're equal, as chosen when they are contingent. And the contingent is what the mirror hides, is what the myth denies, is what the collective narcissism protects against. And the protection is permanent, is structural, is what makes the mirror stage of culture eternal, inevitable, universal. The way that all societies see themselves, as distorted reflections, as idealized images, as mythological narratives that are believed, that are shared, that are maintained, that are the culture, that are the mirror, that are the stage, that are the collective narcissism that defines human social existence, that creates the blind spots, that justifies the violence, that maintains the myth, that every culture exhibits, that every society believes, that every empire proclaims. And the proclaiming is the mirror, is the stage, is the distorted reflection that is culture seeing itself. The suffering is not in having little, but in having less, not in lacking, but in being surpassed, not in absence, but in comparison. And comparison is constant, is unavoidable, is built into perception, into cognition, into the social architecture of human life. Because humans are not isolated processes of absolute value, but are deeply embedded in networks where worth is relative, where position matters more than possession, where status is the thing being tracked, being measured, being fought over. And the fighting is exhausting, is endless, is producing anxiety that has no clear source except the presence of others, the visibility of their achievements, their possessions, their apparent happiness. And the apparent is what matters, is what comparison operates on. Because comparison does not have access to internal states, cannot measure actual satisfaction or genuine contentment, can only measure signals, displays, the external markers that are supposed to indicate success. And success is not absolute, is not a threshold that once crossed brings lasting peace, but is relative, is defined against the success of others, is meaningful only in context, only in relationship, only as position in a hierarchy that has no natural endpoints, no place where more is impossible, no level where comparison stops. And the stopping is what never happens, is what cannot happen, because there is always someone higher, always someone with more, always someone whose position makes one's own position feel insufficient, feel like failure, feel like falling behind. And behind is where comparison places everyone, except the very top, except the singular position that by definition only one can occupy. And even that position is temporary, is unstable, is vulnerable to being surpassed, to losing the lead, to falling back into the mass of strivers who are all measuring themselves against the same unreachable standard. And the unreachable is what drives the system, is what keeps everyone running, keeps everyone comparing, keeps everyone suffering from the gap between where they are and where they see others, where they imagine others, where the displays and signals suggest others have arrived. And the arrival is illusion, is performance, is the curated presentation that social media perfects, that makes comparison more toxic than ever before. Because the comparison is now constant, is now unavoidable, is now the default activity of any moment with a screen. And the screen shows the highlight reel, shows the best moments, the peak experiences, the carefully selected and filtered images that are meant to represent lives, but are really representing brands, representing the performance of success. And the performance is what gets compared against reality, against the unfiltered experience of one's own life, with all its ordinariness, all its mundane moments, all the time that is not photogenic, not shareable, not worth displaying. And the asymmetry creates distortion, creates the sense that everyone else is doing better, is happier, is more successful, is living the life that one should be living, but is not. And the not is experienced as personal failure, as inadequacy, as evidence that something is wrong with the self, when really, what is wrong is the comparison, is the measuring of internal experience against external display, of reality against performance, of the whole of one's life against the curated fragments of others' lives. And the fragments are not representative, are not honest, are not revealing the struggles, the doubts, the failures that are also present but are edited out, are kept private, are not part of the display. And so the display creates impossible standards, creates the sense that success should be constant, that happiness should be visible, that worth should be demonstrable. And demonstrable means comparable, means measurable against others, means existing in the public space where position can be assessed, where rank can be assigned, where the hierarchy becomes visible. And the visibility is what social media provides, is what makes the panopticon complete, is what ensures that everyone is always being watched, always being measured, always being compared, not by a central authority, but by everyone else, by the distributed surveillance of the network, where every post is a signal, every image is a claim, every update is a statement of position, and the position is what matters, is what gets evaluated, is what determines worth in the social economy, where attention is currency and visibility is power, and power is zero-sum, is rivalrous, is gained by some at the expense of others, because attention is finite, is limited, is allocated according to comparison, according to who is most interesting, most successful, most worth watching. And the worth watching is what everyone is competing for, is what drives the performance, is what makes authenticity impossible. Because authenticity does not optimize for attention, does not maximize engagement, does not win the comparison, and winning is what the system demands, is what the architecture incentivizes, is what the algorithms reward, and the rewards go to those who perform best, who display most effectively, who signal status most clearly, and the clarity is achieved through excess, through conspicuous consumption, through the demonstration of resources, of connections, of experiences that others do not have. And the not having is what makes the display valuable, is what makes it worth envying, is what triggers the comparison that produces the anxiety that drives more performance, more display, more competition. And the competition is the prison, is the trap, is the system that has no exit, because exiting means becoming invisible, means losing position, means falling behind. And behind is unbearable, is the failure state, is where the losers are. And no one wants to be a loser. No one wants to be the one who is surpassed, who is left behind, who is forgotten. And the forgetting is what happens to those who stop performing, who stop displaying, who drop out of the comparison. And dropping out is not freedom but is erasure, is not peace but is irrelevance, is not escape but is defeat. And so most stay in, most keep performing, most keep comparing, most keep suffering from the gap between where they are and where they see others. And the seeing is continuous, is unavoidable, is the default state of consciousness. In an environment where everyone's position is visible, where everyone's success is displayed, where everyone's life is performance, and the performance is what gets internalized, becomes the standard against which the self is measured. And the measuring is constant, is automatic, is happening at every moment, in every context, whenever others are present, or even when they are not present but are represented, are visible through screens, through feeds, through the endless stream of signals that constitute social media. And social media is the panopticon perfected, is the prison where everyone is guard and prisoner simultaneously, is watching and being watched, is judging and being judged, is comparing and being compared. And the comparing is the punishment, is the suffering, is the anxiety that has no clear cause except the presence of others, the visibility of their position, the evidence that they have what one does not have, and the not having is experienced as deprivation, as relative deprivation, as the sense that one is lacking not in absolute terms but in comparison to others, and the comparison is the only terms that matter, is the only measurement that counts. Because humans are social, are tribal, are wired to care about position, about rank, about where they stand in the hierarchy. And the hierarchy is not natural, is not fixed, is not based on any inherent quality, but is constructed through comparison, through the constant evaluation of signals, of displays, of the markers that are supposed to indicate worth. And worth is not intrinsic, is not internal, is not a property of the self, but is assigned, is determined by others, is the result of comparison, of measurement, of the social process that ranks everyone according to criteria that are arbitrary, that are culturally specific, that are manipulable. And the manipulation is what social media enables, is what allows anyone to perform success, to display status, to signal position regardless of underlying reality. And the reality is hidden, is private, is not part of the comparison. And so the comparison is always distorted, is always measuring performance against performance, display against display, rather than reality against reality. And the reality is that most people are struggling, are anxious, are feeling inadequate, are suffering from the same comparison that they are inflicting on others, and the inflicting is not intentional, is not malicious, is just participation, is just performing, is just displaying the signals that are required to maintain position, to avoid falling behind, to stay in the game. And the game is the prison, is the system that has no winners, because there is no end point, no level of success that brings peace, no amount of status that ends comparison, because comparison is relative, is always finding someone higher, always finding new metrics, always raising the bar, and the raising is what makes enough impossible, is what ensures that satisfaction is temporary, is what converts every achievement into baseline, into the new normal that is no longer impressive, no longer enviable, no longer worth displaying because everyone else has caught up, has matched the signal, has equaled the performance. And so new signals are needed, new displays are required, new forms of status must be pursued, and the pursuit is endless, is exhausting, is producing the anxiety that characterizes modern life, the sense that one is always falling behind, always insufficient, always failing to measure up. And the measuring up is the problem, is the trap, is the prison, because up is infinite, is unlimited, is always higher than wherever one currently is. And so the climbing never ends, never reaches a summit, never arrives at a place where comparison stops, where enough is recognized as enough, where peace is possible, and peace is not possible as long as comparison continues, as long as others are visible, as long as position matters, and position always matters, is wired into human psychology, is part of the social brain that evolved to track status, to monitor hierarchy, to care intensely about where one stands relative to others. And the relative is the only measure that counts, is the only information that the social brain processes, is why absolute improvements in living standards do not produce corresponding improvements in happiness. Because happiness is relative, is determined by comparison, is about position, not possession, and position is zero-sum, is gained by some at the expense of others, is the ranking that ensures most people feel inadequate most of the time. Because most people are not at the top, are not in the elite positions, are somewhere in the middle or the bottom, are below someone, are being surpassed by someone, are losing the comparison to someone, and the someone is always visible, is always present, is always there to trigger the anxiety, to produce the envy, to create the suffering that comes from measuring oneself against others and finding oneself lacking. And the lacking is not real, is not objective, is only relative, is only meaningful in comparison. But the comparison is what makes it feel real, what makes it feel like failure, what makes it feel like something is wrong, something needs to change, something must be improved. And the improvement is pursued, is worked toward, is achieved. And the achievement brings temporary satisfaction, brings a brief moment of feeling successful, of feeling adequate, of feeling like enough. But the enough is temporary, is quickly replaced by new comparison, by new awareness of those who are higher, who have more, who have surpassed. And the surpassing is the trigger, is what resets the baseline, is what converts achievement into inadequacy, is what makes the prison inescapable, because escaping requires not just achieving more, but achieving more than everyone else. And everyone else is also striving, is also comparing, is also trying to escape through achievement. And so the competition intensifies, the standards rise, the bar keeps moving, and the moving is what makes peace impossible, makes satisfaction temporary, makes enough unattainable, because enough is not an absolute measure, but is relative, is defined by comparison, is determined by position, and position is always vulnerable, is always threatened, is always at risk of being lost. And the risk creates anxiety, creates vigilance, creates the constant monitoring of others, of their signals, of their displays, of any evidence that they're gaining, advancing, surpassing, and the surpassing is what must be prevented, is what drives the performance, is what makes rest impossible, makes dropping out unthinkable, makes the prison unescapable, except by those rare individuals who somehow break free of comparison, who somehow stop measuring themselves against others, who somehow find peace in their own position, regardless of where that position is in the hierarchy. And these individuals are rare, are exceptions, are not the norm, because the norm is comparison, is the constant measurement, is the anxiety that comes from always being aware of others, of their position, of their apparent success, and the apparent is what matters, is what the social brain responds to, is what triggers the envy. And envy is information, is the signal that someone else has something valuable, something worth having, something that could improve one's own position. And the position is what envy is tracking, is what it is designed to make salient, is the gap that needs closing, and the closing is pursued through imitation, through acquisition, through the striving to match what the envied other has, to equal their position, to eliminate the gap. But the gap never closes, is never eliminated, because as soon as one gap is closed, another opens. As soon as one person is matched, another surpasses. As soon as one goal is achieved, the goalposts move, and the moving is what makes the prison permanent, makes the suffering chronic, makes the anxiety inescapable, because the architecture of social comparison is not designed for peace, is not optimized for satisfaction, is designed for striving, for competition, for the endless pursuit of position. And the pursuit is the function, is what the system needs, is what makes the hierarchy dynamic, what keeps people climbing, what ensures that those at the top are always being challenged, always being pursued, always at risk of being overtaken. And the risk is what makes their position valuable, is what makes status worth having, is what creates the scarcity that makes position meaningful. And meaningful means enviable, means desirable, means worth suffering for. And the suffering is universal, is experienced at every level, is not limited to those at the bottom, but is felt even at the top. Because even at the top there is comparison, there is the awareness of others who are close, who are threatening, who might surpass, and the might creates anxiety, creates the need to defend position, to maintain distance, to keep performing, keep displaying, keep signalling status. And the signalling is exhausting, is requiring constant effort, constant vigilance, constant awareness of how one is being perceived, how one is being measured, how one's position is being evaluated by others who are always comparing, always measuring, always judging. And the judging is mutual, is reciprocal, is everyone evaluating everyone else, is the distributed surveillance that makes the panopticon total, that makes escape impossible, that ensures everyone is always in the prison, always being compared, always suffering from the awareness that others are watching, measuring, judging, and that the judgment might be negative, might find one lacking, might assign a lower position than one wants, than one deserves, than one has worked for. And the work is never enough, is never sufficient, is never achieving the permanent security that would allow rest, would allow peace, would allow the comparison to stop mattering. Because the comparison never stops mattering, is always relevant, is always the measure that counts, is what determines worth in the social economy, where position is everything, where rank is identity, where hierarchy is reality, and reality is constructed through comparison, through the constant measurement that assigns everyone a place, a position, a rank. And the rank is always provisional, always temporary, always vulnerable to change, to being surpassed, to falling. And the falling is what everyone fears, is what drives the anxiety, is what makes the prison work. Because the prison is not a place, but is a process, is the constant comparison that measures everyone against everyone else and finds everyone lacking. Because lacking is relative, is inevitable, is the necessary result of a system where only one can be first, where most must be middle, where someone must be last and the last is where no one wants to be, is the position that is avoided, that is fled from, that creates the most anxiety, the most suffering, the most desperate striving to escape. And the escape is pursued through the same means that created the prison, through comparison, through performance, through display, through the signalling of status that is supposed to improve position, but only reinforces the system, only strengthens the prison, only ensures that comparison continues, that measurement persists, that the anxiety remains. And the remaining is permanent, is chronic, is the condition of social existence in an environment where everyone is visible, where position is trackable, where comparison is unavoidable. And the unavoidable is what makes the suffering universal, is what ensures that peace is rare, that satisfaction is temporary, that enough is never enough, because enough is not absolute but is relative, is determined by comparison, is defined by position, and position is always being measured, always being evaluated, always being compared, and the comparison is the prison, is the trap, is the source of suffering that has no solution except the impossible one of stopping comparison, of ceasing to measure oneself against others, of finding worth that is internal rather than relative, that is intrinsic rather than assigned, that is independent of position, independent of rank, independent of the hierarchy that comparison creates and maintains, and the maintenance is collective, is everyone participating, everyone contributing, everyone reinforcing the system by comparing, by displaying, by performing, by caring about position. And the caring is what makes the prison work, is what keeps everyone trapped, is what ensures that suffering continues, that anxiety persists, that peace remains impossible as long as comparison continues, as long as others are visible, as long as position matters. And position will always matter, will always be salient, will always be the measure that counts. Because humans are social, are hierarchical, are wired to care about rank, about status, about where they stand relative to others. And the relative is the only measurement that has ever mattered, is the only comparison that counts, is the prison that has no walls but is inescapable, is the trap that has no lock but cannot be opened, is the suffering that has no cause except comparison, except the presence of others, except the visibility of their position. And the position is always visible, is always present, is always there to measure against, to fall short of, to suffer from the awareness that someone is higher, someone has more, someone is better. And the better is what one is not, is what one is lacking, is what the comparison reveals. And the revealing is the suffering, is the prison, is the condition that cannot be escaped as long as comparison continues, and comparison will continue, must continue, is built into the architecture of social existence, is the foundation of the hierarchy, is the mechanism that assigns position. And position is everything, is worth, is identity, is the measure of the self, and the self is always being measured, always being compared, always being found insufficient. And the insufficient is the prison, is the trap, is the suffering that is universal, that is inescapable. That is the cost of being social, of being visible, of being in comparison with others. And the comparison is the prison. And the prison is where everyone lives, where everyone suffers, where peace is impossible and enough is never enough.